Hello, and welcome to the next video in our Intro to Creative Web Dev series. In the last video, in the last week or so, you learned about CSS, which lets you add style rules, style properties to your HTML to style it, and we got into a few things like color and font and like bold and italicized, that kind of thing. And this week's video kind of builds on that to introduce different ways to lay out your HTML elements. So in addition to like giving them colors and fonts and stuff, you can now tell them how to position themselves. So I don't know, for example, if I'm just looking at this web page that I have open already, there's like this top sort of navigation bar, there's this left nav, there's like a content section, which itself contains a bunch of stuff, and then down here towards the bottom there's like a footer and stuff. So how do you lay out your web page? And the answer is there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but we're going to walk through some of the more common ones. So this is a little bit maybe behind the scenes, but I've actually kind of struggled to figure out the best way to talk about this stuff, because it gets really complicated because there are like many years of history here, and it leads to this kind of confusing state where there's like 5 different ways to do it, and which one you choose kind of depends on your context and your preferences. But I personally have found a lot of value in understanding how they kind of interacted through history. So I don't know, maybe that's a little grandiose, but all of that to say, I want to start with a very brief history of how CSS layout has been done since the very beginning days, and I want to maybe not spend too much time on that because I could ramble about it forever, but I want to jump to Flexbox and then maybe leave the rest of it for later, or for not at all, honestly. But okay, that's my kind of plan here. So let me start by maybe I'll create a replit project just so that we are working in the same environment that that we've been using before. So I'm going to create an HTML CSS JS project. I'm going to call it like CSS layout. Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm creating that, and let me take you back in time while this is working to around 1993. And 1993 is when the very first version of HTML was released, and that very first version of HTML did not include any CSS. So you were limited to using HTML tags, and it was, not all of the HTML tags that you have today, but whatever was released in 1993. I don't know why this is taking so long to load. Maybe if I refresh. Sure. Okay. So if I wanted to lay out some content in my HTML, how did I do that? How did I do that before CSS? And long story short, the answer is I would use a table tag. And so I can maybe do table tag, and I am not going to be able to remember this stuff off my head. I think it's a table row, and then I need what, like a table, is it table cell or table D? Ooh, what's this? Is this what I want? Table D, T, TD? Sure, let's find out. If I click here, does it tell me? Sure. We're going to find out. And I could maybe have like left section and then right section, right section. Let's see if this works. And yeah, okay. So now I have a left section and a right section, and I think I can do something like, if I say border equals 1, maybe something like this. Yeah, okay, so now I have borders around my sections, and so in 1993, this is how you would do it if you wanted to create something with like a left nav and then the main content. So I can maybe have like a whole like UL in here, and I can say maybe LI of like 1 and an LI of 2, and I'm going to clean this code up in a second, but that's really gross. LI of 3, if I save this, does it automatically format? Ooh, beautiful. Okay, so now my left section is more, involved, and maybe you can imagine that those are links to different sections of the web page, blah, blah, blah. And maybe this is like, some p tags. Here is some content, and maybe another p tag that's just like, here is some more content. I'll save that, auto format, love it. Okay, so now you can kind of imagine that if I kept at it, kept going this way, I could build out my web page. Maybe I had another table row to be like the top nav, and maybe another one down at the bottom to be the footer, and it would work. I could do it. So I'm kind of tempted to say like header, and then maybe another one down here for footer. And I think this will work-ish. No, didn't. I think I might need to be like, I might need TDs in there. But maybe, I didn't try this on purpose, but you can maybe see how annoying this will get, right? Like I have to have so many tags just to make like a little rectangle around my content, and will that work? Sort of ish, and there's probably ways to make this stretch, but it's getting unwieldy already. And this is also bad for like screen reader users, for example, because your screen reader will like announce the content as if it was data, and it's just a whole big thing. So this is how you would do it in the year of our Lord 1993, but it's not how you do it anymore. You should never use table to do layout anymore. So what do you use instead? Well, let me cast ourselves back to, let's say the year, where are we? 1996-ish. And that is when CSS was first released. That was like CSS 1. And back in that time, CSS included things like font colors and things like that, bolding and italicizing. And you could use those CSS rules to style your text, but there was nothing in it to do positioning. You could style the colors and fonts and stuff, but no layout was included in the very first version of CS1 or CSS1. And okay, so there we were. We were still using the table tag up until around 1998. So that's when CSS2 was released. And you know, I mentioned here real quick that HTML 3.2 was released in 97. That included div tag, and that's going to come in handy in a second. But in CSS2 in 1998, we received a new ability in CSS, and that's the float property. So let me go back to Replit and kind of work through this a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to change some of these into divs. I'm actually going to get rid of my header and footer. I don't think they are sparking much joy, but the ideas are the same in that you know, you'll use HTML tags to do your layout. So okay, let me create a div, which is just it's an HTML tag that means rectangle. You can think of it as it's just a rectangle around some content. By default, it doesn't actually have a border or anything, but you can think of it as an imaginary rectangle that you're drawing around a section of your HTML. So I'm going to create two divs, and here, yep, and another closing tag. Okay, so now I have two divs, and I need to get rid of my table. And those divs contain some HTML that'll auto format, beautiful. And okay, so my first div has a UL with 1, 2, 3. You can imagine those are links. And then my second div has two p tags in it. And by default, these divs will show up one after another, kind of vertically. But my whole goal here is that I want it to show like left and right. I guess I should do that reverse, left and right. And we are back in 1998, where now we have a new ability, and that's to use the float property. So let me give this like a class of, I don't know, left maybe, and I'll say this is a class of maybe content. And then I want to jump over to my style.css. Oh, I need a line of code that I don't have handy. Okay, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain here. I need to go jump over and find this line of code real quick. It's the line that gets me access to the external style sheet. It's this one. I never remember this line of code, but that's okay because I know where to look it up. So I'm going to steal that line of code and just kind of put it up here. Okay, so now I have linked to my style file, style.css, and I don't think it has anything by default, or just has some defaults. Okay, so I'm going to delete those. And all right, so now I'm back to having two divs, one with a class of left and one with a class of content. So I'm going to jump over to style.css and I'm going to say dot left. First of all, maybe I'll give it a border of like thin, solid red, just so we can kind of look at it. And if I save this, does that automatically? It does. Okay, and then I'll say like dot content. I'll give that a border of thin, solid blue, maybe. Thin, solid blue. Sure. And so you can kind of see that these are just two rectangles of content, one with 1, 2, 3, and one with here's some content, here's some more content. And now if I use float, I can say float left, and then I'm also going to give this a margin left of, I don't know, maybe 200 pixels. Let's see what this does. And okay, that is closer to what we want. You can kind of see that it's not exactly right. There's something not quite right here. Does this need a width or something? Maybe width of like 500 pixels. That's probably too much. Maybe 300 pixels. And no, why? Okay, I'm missing a line of code, but let me steal it from myself here. No, this should work. Margin left 100 pixels, margin left 100 pixels. Do I have a mistake? Oh, I have a space here. So, yeah, okay. I'm trying to do this as fast as I possibly can, and I'm messing up. So let me try this again. Let me run this, and okay, now I can go back to it being normal. Okay, so now I have in my index.html file a div that's has a class of left and a div that has a class of content, and then the style.css file styles those divs. And because of this float left, it does that. Instead of them showing like one after the other, it's now floated over to the left. And I could do other things here. I could maybe say like, give this some padding, and I could sort of iterate on this and make this a little bit more, closer to what I want. Maybe get rid of these like these circles, and it will work. However, you can see that even in just designing this like 6 lines of code, I made several mistakes just because it's still kind of unwieldy. And the weird thing where you have to like give it a margin, because like technically when you have an element with a float, it technically doesn't take up any space. And so if you don't set the margins of the elements around it, it gets really gross. So let me put that back. And if I do something like add like a footer, maybe, so maybe I have like another div down here that's like, this is a footer. You can imagine that it would have like links or something, and it's probably not what we wanted. And so there are ways around it, but it's just it's better than what we had before. It's better than the table approach, but it's still pretty unwieldy. So, all right, I think I've rambled about the history for maybe long enough. I'll just say that there are other ways to do it. So, for example, there's something called inline blocks that you could also try. If you are curious, I recommend reading about this stuff because it is kind of interesting. But I will just say that was the way we were doing it for, I don't know, like 20 years or so. The way we did layout in CSS was either using floats like we just saw, or blocks, which are kind of a similar thing. And then in, let's see, 2017, which is almost, it's like 19 years later, right? Finally, CSS3-ish was released. And CSS3 comes with a new feature, and that is called Flexbox. And Flexbox improves a lot of this. Let me change some of this code now. So I still need my div class equals left, and I have my div class equals content. And let me get rid of some of these stylings. I'll change that and I'll change that. I'm just going to put it back to being like just regular old divs. Let me run this. And now they will show up like one on top of each other. And so to use Flexbox, I am going to create a new div that kind of contains everything else. So I'm going to say div class equals, maybe I'll call it just container. It's a pretty common name. And then I'll close my div out down here. And okay. So now I have a container div, and let me maybe style that container div. So I'll say dot container, and I'll give this another border of thin solid, I don't know, green maybe. So the container will have a green border, and I don't know if you'll actually be able to see it, but we're going to find out. So yeah, okay, it's kind of hard to see, but can I zoom in? Not really. You'll have to take my word for it that there's a green border kind of around the very outside. Maybe if I open up a new tab, you'll be able to see it. Can I zoom in this way? Oh, there we go. Okay. So there's a green border sort of on the outside, and then inside of that green square, there's two squares where there's a red one and a blue one. Okay. So you have your container div containing your other two divs. So far, we haven't done any Flexbox stuff. And what I'm going to do is add another style to the container div, which is the display property, and I'm going to give it a value of flex. I'm going to save this, and voila. Now we have our left div to the left of our content div. And, you know, I have some extra stuff in here to just kind of make it look okay and to demonstrate like exactly which one is which. But really, this is the only line of code I needed for all of that. So compare this line of code to my really messy table code, or this line of code with how complicated it was to do it with floats. And this is sort of the power of Flexbox. First of all, you get a lot sort of just by default. So the default is that the divs will show up like next to each other. You can change that, but and then there's some other defaults, but I will maybe talk about them in a second. So here we are. We have our container that is a Flexbox container. So let me go back to my index.html, and so I have my outer div class equals container, which is a flex container, which means that it now, your browser, when it sees that there's a Flexbox container, it no longer follows the sort of default layout rules that show things like one after another, like stacked vertically. Instead, it follows Flexbox rules, which have a whole bunch of things that you can customize. So let me jump to that. How best to talk about this? So this page that I'm kind of working from is it's honestly too long because I kind of went through and showed a bunch of examples, but I think at a high level, what I want you to sort of think about, or how I encourage you to think about Flexbox, and then from there you can look up individual properties, is you set Flex properties either on the container div or on its children div. So for example, let's say, let's start with display flex actually. Display flex is always on the container, and it is what kind of kicks everything off. It says, hey browser, now that you are in a flex container, follow the Flexbox rules. And let me see, so let me go with like flex direction maybe. So by default, flex direction is sort of horizontal, it's left to right. So let me maybe customize this, and I'll say flex direction. If for some reason I wanted it to go the other way, I actually don't remember which is which, but let me go with like column. I think that's maybe the way I want. So if I run that, and now we're back to the old way where it's displaying things kind of vertically. You still get some other defaults that can come in handy, but you can customize which direction things are laid out, and it's all based on one style rule, one style property, versus all that rigmarole we had to jump through with floats and stuff. So now if I change this back to row, which is the default, now I have it laid out left to right. So another one, let's say like flex. Let me do like justify content, maybe. Yeah. So another property that you would put on the Flexbox container is like justify content, and this lets you sort of customize the rules that are applied to your elements as your browser lays them out. So I'll say justify content, and maybe I will say like space around, and I will run that and see what happens. And so now you see that the layout has added some space around the content. So it's kind of right there in the name, rather than just being like all up on each other. This left one kind of has its own space. This right one has its own space. And the reason this is important is, let me save this and pop this out into its own tab. You can imagine that we've like applied these rules to maybe a real website, not just two divs, but let me pop this open in its new in its own window so that I can do so I can play with the width of it. So one of the main benefits of Flexbox that improves over the things we had before is it solves a problem that's kind of relatively, I don't know if recent is the right word anymore, but if you imagine back in 1993, the people looking at a web page were kind of all working from like tiny little screens where probably putting things kind of vertically and one after another probably made the most sense. And over time, your monitors had higher resolution, and so your styles or your layouts tended to kind of use that space a little bit better. So for example, here I have my left nav over here because I have plenty of room on this monitor. Or if I go, I don't know, let's pick on another website here where you see that there's a lot going on. There's stuff on the left, there's stuff on the right, and it started to make more sense to lay out things kind of horizontally, and that's where things like the float or the inline blocks came in handy. But then some more time went on, and around, I don't know, 2007 or so, everyone started using smartphones. And so now all of a sudden, we were looking at the internet on tiny screens again. And so nowadays, you really have no idea ahead of time how big the screen will be when someone visits your website. So will they be viewing it on some big fancy monitor? Will they be viewing it on a tiny phone? Will they be viewing it on a tablet? Something in between? And trying to get something that kind of does something reasonable on all of those screens is really, really hard. But what Flexbox gives you is some sort of reasonable defaults. So I'm back here, and I don't know how reasonable this is just because it's kind of a goofy example, but let me change the width of my window and we'll kind of watch what happens. So let me pull this out into its own window, sure. And let me make the window smaller and kind of watch what happens. So my outermost div is sort of staying at the width of the window, and my innermost divs are kind of staying their own size, but the space that the container div has is decreasing. So if I do it again, if I increase it, notice that the space around it is decreasing. And I don't have to set that myself. You can customize the behavior, but I didn't have to tell the browser to do that. Those are all the sort of reasonable defaults that that Flexbox is giving me. So let me pop that back in. I might come back to it later. But for example, let's see, I could customize this even further. So maybe instead of having space around, maybe I want those to be centered. So I'll run that. And now they're kind of smushed in the center, and the space is on the outside. And this will work pretty much no matter what screen size I'm on. If I make it really tiny, the space around it decreases, but the content itself stays the same size. Anyway, so all of that to say that the power of Flexbox is in a few of those things that I mentioned. One is you can do a lot in just a few lines of code, and the other one, now that you have used Flexbox, now that you're using Flexbox, the layout is designed to work on changing screen sizes. So that's what the flex part means, basically. Anyway, okay, that was a little rambly, but hopefully that made some amount of sense. Anyway, let me kind of continue talking about the kinds of things you can do with Flexbox. So I've used a few example properties that you can set on the container div. And let's maybe talk about some things you can set on the children. So let me see. Let's go down to maybe here-ish. Right. Okay. So in the example that I have here, you can see that because of the defaults that I was just talking about, the children are sort of staying the same size all the time. But let's say I actually didn't want the size to only go to my the open space that's around the elements. Let's say I actually wanted this content div to get the extra room. So I can set a flex property on the child div to customize that behavior. So let me go here. And so on the content div, which is this one here, I'm going to say flex grow, and I'm going to give it a 1. And I'm going to run this, and I'm going to hope for the best because I don't actually know if I remember this syntax off the top of my head. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so let me refresh this over here and talk about how this is behaving. So now, instead of the container div having a bunch of open space in it, now the content takes up the remaining space. So this left div has the default behavior of being kind of as small as the layout can make it. But because I have used the flex grow property on the content child, now that child is going to take up the rest of the space. And if I decrease this, if I increase this, it'll change the size. Now it gets a little wonky, honestly, because this 1, like what does this 1 represent? And this 1 is like a ratio in proportion to other children. So let's say I give my left child a flex grow of 1, and I give my content a flex grow of 2. So what I'm saying to Flexbox is when you are faced with different widths, when you have to lay out this these elements, long story short, make this content grow twice as fast as the left bar, or give it twice as much room. So if I open up my other tab here so I can play around with it, as I change my size, so let me actually start out really tiny. So now you can kind of see that very roughly the content is around twice as wide as the left nav. And if I increase that, then that ratio kind of stays the same. And because I'm working in the ratio, I don't need to care, like, is it exactly 500 pixels? Is it 1,000 pixels? Is it, whatever. I am just saying, make it twice as big, and I trust you to make it reasonable. That's, again, sort of the power of Flexbox. Okay, I've been talking for a while, and I know I tend to ramble when I get into this kind of stuff because it's interesting and also confusing, but I might kind of leave the new stuff there. So the new stuff is, first of all, I walked through just a very brief history of CSS where in the beginning there were tables and it was bad, but this is the only thing we had. Then we had things like float and inline blocks, which were better than tables, but still kind of cumbersome, still kind of annoying to work with. You will still see those, like in the wild, in normal code, you'll still see them because they are still part of CSS, and honestly, they're still used everywhere. But the newer thing, new-ish anyway, is Flexbox, and it gives you all of those powerful things. So that's the new stuff that I threw at you. From here, I don't expect you or I don't encourage you, I don't want you to memorize a bunch of Flex properties. I don't think that's the way to do it. Instead, I think that the thing to remember when you are working with Flexbox is that, first off, you have display flex. That's the most important thing that kicks everything off. And from there, it's a matter of applying flex properties to either the container or the children. So you can go back here and read through a bunch of more specific properties that you can use, but the idea is going to be pretty similar. You're going to put them on either the container or the children, and it's going to customize the way that Flexbox behaves based on different widths of the window. I will also point out like this beautiful resource. It's called A Complete Guide to Flexbox, and it's on csstricks.com. And it's this really cool summary of all of the different Flexbox properties, sort of organized by, on the left here, it's stuff you can set on the container. On the right here, it's stuff you can set on the children of that container. And it has this nice, like, kind of, I don't know, cartoony explanation for everything. So flex wrap, for example, it looks like that wraps the elements to the next line or something. Here's justify content. This is one we were talking about earlier. So I had space around here. So you might change that to space between, for example, or space evenly. And this gives you kind of just a high level visualization of what will happen. And then same thing for the children. So looks like align self can change the way things sort of position themselves in relation to their siblings. But yeah, I don't want to like make a video that's 3 hours long where I go through every single one of these, because honestly, I think that it's probably better for you to just kind of skim through it, and when you need something, consult either this page, or go to your favorite search engine and type in something like, I don't know, like Flexbox center content, if that's your goal. Cool. So I think I'm going to end it there. Let me see if there's anything else I really need to talk about in this video. Okay, I think maybe what I'll do is I'll spend some time implementing what's called the Holy Grail layout, which is, let me just show it to you. Here's the end result, where this is a very, very common layout, because it's kind of, I don't know, it's used everywhere, where you'll generally have a header, you might have a left sidebar, maybe some content, maybe a right sidebar, maybe a footer. You don't need to have every single one of them, but it's always easier to remove stuff once you have it. So let me maybe spend just a few minutes kind of implementing this in Flexbox from scratch, just to kind of show you how that would work. Okay, so I'm actually kind of close, even though I haven't really done much, because I already have Flexbox on my container. So okay, let me think about this in terms of divs. So I have a container which is going to contain, if I go here, it's going to contain 3 children, and the first child is the header. The second child is like the main content, which itself will contain some children, and then the third child is the footer. Okay, so let me start there, maybe. So yeah, I have my container, and so let me put like div class equals header here, and yeah, I want to close that out, and maybe I'll just say header. And then I think I just want another one, so that's div. So left, this one's going to contain the content itself, so maybe I'm running out of names for this stuff. I might actually call this one content and then this one middle content or something, but let me call this one, yeah, let me call this content. Class equals, let me call it main, actually, to disambiguate from content. And let me close that here. So now I have a header div and a main div, and that's it so far. And so let me add a footer. Maybe I should have started from scratch. Now I'm thinking about this, but whatever. So pretty obviously this isn't right yet, because my header's on the left and my footer's on the right. I don't want that. So let me go back to style.css, and I'm going to say flex direction column first. I'm going to get rid of some of this extra stuff that I have here, just because I don't need it anymore. I'll leave my borders in. Okay, so that's already closer to what I wanted. So I have header, and then the content, and the content, or the main section. The main section contains left content, and maybe I'll add another one for right. Actually, let me just steal this code and copy paste it. And Okay, so that's going to be right. And I don't know why it's taking so long. While I wait for that, let me go over here and style it. Beautiful. Love it when Replit stops working. Why stop it? No, nothing. Cool. What if I open up a new tab? Yeah, okay. This works. So now you have my right section over here. Okay, there. Finally worked. And I haven't styled that yet. I could add another border, so maybe I'm running out of colors. Thin solid yellow. The borders are just to make it more obvious what's what. But okay, this is close-ish, but there's something wrong with my main section because I didn't want that to be like one after the other vertically. I wanted it to be horizontal. So if I go back to my style here, if I go to main, I haven't styled main at all. So dot main, again, maybe going back here, main is this div, this kind of center div, which itself contains children. So it is a child that contains children. It's a div that contains other divs. So I want that one actually to also have display flex. And let me run that. And yeah, that's already pretty close. Some of these borders are a little distracting and ugly, but here it is actually. I have my header up here, and then I have a left nav, a main content section, and then a right nav, and then a footer. Some of these borders are goofy, but the idea is that now if I go back to index.html and I just have, maybe a bunch more content in here, it will sort of just work. And now my header's still at the top, my left nav is still on the left, my right nav is still on the right, my content takes up, the middle part, and then I have my footer. So if I go over here and I change the size of my window, and I could further customize this, for example. So maybe I want my main to maybe I'll do that justify contents thing that we did earlier. So maybe I'll justify my content to have space around, maybe space between, and I'll run that, and I'll open up my other tab. I've got too many tabs. And I'll refresh this. So now, based on the properties that I've given stuff, now my content is sort of spaced out a little bit better. And if I change the width of my window, it'll sort of just work. Everything will always have a relatively reasonable default layout. And again, I could keep going. I could maybe have like flex grow on my content. So maybe I'll say flex grow 1. But the idea is that I am customizing either a parent or a child by adding a flex property to that element. In this case, it's been divs, but it can be anything. So let me refresh this, and now my content is taking up more of the room. And from here, I could do a lot of other things. I could make this header actually contain like links. I could do the same thing with my left and right navs. Maybe add some more images or something. But the idea is hopefully there, where you use Flexbox to create the layout or the rules about the layout, and you set Flexbox properties on either the parent element or the child element to customize the way your site is laid out on various screen sizes. And it all kind of works magically. So as a challenge, if you aren't convinced that this is better than it used to be, try doing this with floats, or try doing this with inline blocks. It is possible. It's just really annoying. Okay, so I think that is maybe just a summary of how I would approach, designing a layout. Maybe you don't care about all of the pieces, or maybe you need other, sub layouts in your content section. But the idea is there. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is I'm purposely limiting this video to Flexbox because honestly, because I recorded it before with everything and it was just way too long. So I'm stopping here, but just know that there is another layout in CSS, and that's called Grid. Grid is even newer than Flexbox, I think. um, yeah, okay. But it's another way to lay out your components. It's similar to Flexbox in that you first of all you set display grid, similar to how you display Flex on Flexbox containers, and then from there your browser obeys the grid layout rules instead of the default rules, and then you set grid properties on your either parent elements or your child elements. But honestly, I think learning Flexbox is enough, so I am going to stop at Flexbox. Um, okay, and then the very last thing I'll say is there's a ton of resources down here. Flex and just CSS and layout in general can be honestly really confusing, but I threw a bunch of links down here, and these are what I used to teach myself all of this stuff. So I definitely recommend checking those out. And of course, you can ask me questions as you are working with this stuff. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we actually start to use this stuff in a project. So I'll see you in that one.